University Confucian Association, and also a PhD candidate in the Department of Religion. Today is the 2017 annual lecture of Boston University Confucian Association. We invited our distinguished guest, Professor Bryan Norden, to deliver a speech on Confucianism and Chinese philosophy. Before introducing Professor Bryan Norden, let me briefly introduce the association. BU Confucian Association is a student group aimed to promote the modernization and globalization of Confucianism. It was established in the fall of 2014 and is the first Confucian student group in all American colleges and universities. The second one was actually established last year in the University of Chicago, and its founder has a very good connection with us. The BU Confucian Association's main activity includes a weekly community reading and dance group from 2014 to 16. And we also have hosted more than 15 scholar lectures given by distinguished Confucian scholars throughout the world. So Professor Bryan, who is on the seat, actually delivered speech last semester. And in the summer of 2016, we also organized the first Confucian retreat in North America. The association has a website, www.bostonconfucianism.org, and its main activities have been reported by mainstream Chinese and English media, such as Huangminzhibao, so all the Chinese students know what is Huangminzhibao, in the Huffington Post, in the international blog of Chinese philosophy, Walk, Wet, and Way. Last thing about BU Confucian Association I want to introduce is funding. It's all from public donation. And we hope we can continue our activities under your generous support. So next, let me introduce Professor Bryan Norden. Professor Bryan Norden is a professor in the philosophy department in the Department of Chinese and Japanese at Wanser College. He has published 8 books on Chinese and comparative philosophy, including Introduction to Classical Chinese Philosophy and Readings in Later Chinese Philosophy. He is an excellent translator for many important Confucian texts, such as the Mentions, and a number of new Confucian masters' works. In the fall, Bryan will be taking up a visiting position as a Kong Yin Tong Temple professor at Yale NUS College in Singapore. Bryan is also the international director of the Center for Comparative Philosophy at Wuhan University in China. Although Bryan has long been well known among scholars in his field, Bryan recently achieved broader notoriety through an editorial he wrote with Jane Gutfield of Smith College. The editorial, which appeared in May of 2016 in the Stone, the philosophy column of the New York Times, challenged the U.S. philosophy departments to change their names to Departments of Anglo-European Philosophy, so long as they refuse to teach works by Chinese, Indian, African, and Native American philosophers. The editorial was immediately translated into Chinese, lambasted by conservative publications for failing to acknowledge the superiority of Western culture, and heatedly discussed on over 30 websites. Based on the Times editorial, Bryan wrote a book, Taking Back Philosophy, a multicultural manifesto, which is coming out in the fall of this year. So this editorial and its related new publication is actually one major reason that the Department of Philosophy at BU has invited Bryan to deliver a speech this afternoon. And the first speech title is A Multicultural Philosophy Manifesto. If the first speech addresses the theory of a controversial yet very important topic, tonight, fortunately, Bryan's talk will be on a less controversial topic and can be seen as a concrete example how his multicultural philosophy is practiced in a Confucian context. So the title of his speech tonight is Like Loving a Lovely Sight. 如好好色. So if any Chinese students here is from the Great Learning, 如好好色. Like loving a lovely sight. Similes and metaphors in Chinese philosophy. The entire speech will be 1 hour for lecture and half an hour for questioning. And I would not interrupt between these two parts. So Bryan will continue to control the entire stage. So let's welcome Bryan and enjoy his speech.
Thank you for that generous introduction, and thank you all for coming today. Some philosophers treat metaphors and similes as simple ornamentation. Consider Mozi, a Chinese philosopher of the 5th century BCE, whose style is often compared to that of contemporary analytic philosophers. After one prolonged stretch of tight argumentation, he allows himself the following simile. To oppose my doctrines with the doctrines of others is the same as tossing eggs at a rock. Even if you exhausted all the eggs in the world, the rock would still be there. You could not destroy it. Now, this simile does not actually add any content to Mozi's worldview or his arguments for it. It's really candy, devoid of intellectual content, but given as a reward to the student for having read the end of the lesson. And yes, I'm aware that in describing it as candy, I am also using a metaphor which has no intellectual content and is just a rhetorical flourish. Other philosophers, both in China and the West, use metaphors in a more substantive manner. Substantive metaphors contribute something of importance beyond an empty rhetorical flourish. There is considerable dispute, though, about what the something is the substantive metaphors contribute. One influential view is that of Donald Davidson, who gave a classic non-propositional interpretation of metaphors. According to Davidson, metaphors are like pictures, or more crudely, like a bonk on the head. And that they invite us to view the world in a certain way, but do not themselves convey any propositional content. In contrast with Davidson, Stanley Cavell argued that metaphors do have propositional content. The content of a metaphor, Cavell suggested, can be expressed by a paraphrase of that metaphor into propositions that can be true or false. In her insightful essay, Showing, Telling, and Seeing, Metaphor and Poetic Language, Elizabeth Camp of Rutgers University argues that each side in this debate captures part of the truth about metaphors, and that we can gain a deeper understanding of metaphors by combining the insights of the two approaches. She writes, an adequate theory of metaphor needs to acknowledge that metaphorical utterances both undertake speech acts with accessible contents and induce perspectives for thinking about one thing as something else. The content is propositional, even if somewhat vague and indeterminate, while the perspective is importantly non-propositional. I would paraphrase Camp's insight in the following way. We can unpack a metaphor in the sense of accurately extracting from it propositions that are true or false. However, unpacking a substantive metaphor does not exhaust the value of the metaphor. A metaphor invites us to view one thing as something else. And adopting a perspective in which we view one thing as something else, looking at something in a certain way, is intrinsically open-ended, so it has no specific propositional content. In my talk today, I want to illustrate Professor Camp's interpretation of metaphor by looking at a few seminal metaphors and similes in traditional Chinese philosophy. And I want to show that if we think about these metaphors or similes properly, they both can be unpacked into specific propositional content, but also have a broader application which goes beyond any simple propositions we can extract from them. In particular, I shall focus on 3 examples from Confucianism. The metaphor that humans have innate who has merely heard that tigers are dangerous. Now, the first metaphor of sprouts comes from Mungsa, a thinker also often known by the Latinization of his name, Mencius. So when Jesuit missionaries went to China, they realized that the two most important Confucian thinkers by far were Kongzi himself and Mungsa. And so they came up with Latinizations of these two philosophers' names, Confucius and Mencius, because they wanted to write about them in Latin to educate people back in Europe. And Mungsa or Mencius is often called the second stage of Confucianism, meaning he's second in importance only to Confucius himself. I like to compare the relationship between Confucius and Mencius to the relationship between Jesus and the Apostle Paul. Jesus and Confucius are, of course, the founders of movements of immense historical importance. However, the precise form that these movements took was deeply influenced by their later followers. The form Christianity took was deeply shaped by the Apostle Paul. The form that Confucianism took was deeply shaped by Mungsa. The similarities continue. Mungsa lived a couple generations after Confucius, so he never met him. And the Apostle Paul never met Jesus unless you count that flyby on the road to Damascus. Mungsa's sayings, dialogues, and debates are recorded in the eponymous work, the Mungsa. And in one of the most famous passages in this text, Mungsa presents the following thought experiment. He says, humans all have hearts that are not unfeeling toward others. The reason why I say that humans all have hearts that are not unfeeling toward others is this. Suppose someone suddenly saw a child about to fall into a well. Everyone in such a situation would have a feeling of alarm and compassion, not because one sought to get in good with the child's parents, not because one wanted fame among their neighbors and friends, and not because one would dislike the sound of the child's cries. From this we can see that if one is without the feeling of compassion, one is not a human. Now, notice the following points about this. Mungsa asks us to imagine a case in which a child is in danger. Children, since they're innocent and non-threatening, trigger our compassion more easily than adults. 2, we're supposed to imagine that a person suddenly sees a child. The suddenness is important because it suggests that the reaction will be unreflective. There's no time to think about how the child's parents are very wealthy and influential and might benefit by saving the child, or how neat it would be if everybody in the neighborhood thought we were cool because we saved a child's life. 3, the passage is often misquoted as stating that any human would save the child at the well. However, Mungsa does not commit himself to anything as strong as that. He merely states that any human in such a situation would have a feeling of alarm and compassion. The feeling could be fleeting. Perhaps one's second thought would be about self-interest. You might think that, oh, if I rush to save that child, the well looks like it's crumbling, perhaps I'll fall into the well myself. Or perhaps your second thought would be cruel. You might think, you know what? I don't like that kid's parents. I think I'll just let that kid drown and just punish them that way. All Mungsa is arguing for is the universal human capacity to feel genuine compassion in at least some circumstances, at least momentarily. 4, Mungsa invites us to consider what we would say of someone who did not have at least a fleeting feeling of compassion when suddenly confronted with a child about to fall into a well. He suggests, plausibly I think, that we would describe such a person as inhuman. In summary, the child of the well thought experiment describes the reaction to a child, a paradigmatic object of compassion, that is sudden, so there's no time to formulate ulterior motives. And Mungsa only claims that a human would at least have a reaction of alarm and compassion. He does not claim that everyone would act to save the child. And he suggests that we would regard someone who lacked such a reaction as an inhuman beast rather than a human being. Now, one of Mungsa's distinctive doctrines is that there are 4 cardinal virtues: benevolence, righteousness, wisdom, and propriety. presenting the child at the well thought experiment, Mungsa goes on to explain how each of the four cardinal virtues is grounded in a particular emotional capacity or attitude. He says, from this we can see that if one is without the feeling of compassion, one is not a human. If one is without the feeling of disdain, one is not a human. If one is without the feeling of deference, one is not a human. If one is without the feeling of approval and disapproval, one is not a human. The feeling of compassion is the sprout of benevolence. The feeling of disdain is the sprout of righteousness. The feeling of deference is the sprout of propriety. The feeling of approval and disapproval is the sprout of wisdom. People having these four sprouts is like they're having four limbs. So Mungsa uses a thought experiment to argue that the capacity for compassion is an essential attribute of a human being. However, he then states that three other emotional reactions are equally essential to a human being: disdain, deference, and approval and disapproval. Mungsa discusses that these three reactions and their associated virtues. He discusses these in other passages. And it's a tasty issue why Mungsa thinks it's obvious, once he's given us an argument for believing in compassion, that we must also have the other three virtues. One possibility suggested by the medieval commentator Zhu Xi is that Mungsa believes in the unity of the virtues. That Mungsa believes, for example, that all virtues are ultimately manifestations of benevolence. As interesting as that is, it's not what I want to focus on now. What I want to focus on is Mungsa's use of the sprout metaphor in connection with the emotion of compassion and the virtue of benevolence. How does our feeling of alarm and compassion, triggered at the sudden sight of a child about to fall into a well, like the sprout of a plant? If we unpack the sprout metaphor, three characteristics of sprouts seem especially important. One, the sprout of a plant is not the same as the fully formed plant. Many of the capacities and characteristics of the fully formed plant will be absent from the sprout. That could be, maybe if you're really into agriculture or gardening, by looking at that, but I can't tell, is that the sprout of a rose? Is that the sprout of an apple tree? I don't know, whatever it is, it doesn't have the characteristics of the full-blown plant yet. Similarly, the sprout of benevolence is not the fully formed virtue of benevolence. In claiming that all humans have the sprouts of benevolence, Mungsa is not claiming that all humans are benevolent. Two, the sprout of a plant is different from the seed in that a sprout is more active and reactive. A sprout grows given a hospitable environment and actively responds to the presence of light and water. Similarly, the sprout of benevolence is not a passive capacity, but is an active tendency to respond to the suffering of other sentient creatures. Three, the sprout of a plant can be nurtured and, given a hospitable environment, will develop into a mature plant. Likewise, the sprout of benevolence can be nurtured into the mature virtue of benevolence. In summary, the sprout metaphor suggests that the innate human capacity for benevolence is incipient rather than fully developed, but active rather than passive, and capable of being cultivated rather than static or fixed. Now, so far, my discussion might seem to support the view that metaphors can be unpacked into literal propositional content without loss of significance. After all, haven't I just told you what Mungsa really means by saying that the feeling of compassion is the sprout of benevolence? My paraphrase might be mistaken, of course, but wouldn't the mistake simply be that I attributed propositional content to the metaphor that it doesn't have, or I failed to attribute some of the propositional content that it does have? I don't think so. I think the metaphor means more than just the propositional content I rightly or wrongly extracted from it. And I think Mungsa himself helps us to see why. Every year that I teach the story of the child at the well, students ask the same question. It's probably a question that a lot of you are thinking about right now. What if someone did not have the feeling of alarm and compassion that Mungsa insists all humans would have? Raise your hand if you recognize this actor in this role. Wow, I feel really old. Okay. This is Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs. It's a good movie. It still holds up. So if you haven't seen it, I'd recommend it. It's a thriller. It also has a kind of interesting feminist subtext to it, which is quite interesting. And I should have known because I asked my kids, who like to remind me how uncool I am. I said, will people recognize Hannibal Lecter? And my daughter said, well, we will because you make us watch weird movies. But no, most people won't. So, but anyway, this is supposed to be a typical, what we call psychopath. That is to say, somebody who is unperturbed by the suffering of other humans or even amused by it. So what would Moses say about humans who, like Hannibal Lecter, apparently lack even the least compassion? Moses hints at an answer to this challenge in the very passage where he tells the child of the well story. Recall that after listing the 4 sprouts of benevolence, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom, Moses introduces a new simile. He said, people having these 4 sprouts is like they're having 4 limbs. Now, surely Moses is aware that not everybody has 4 limbs. 4 limbs is what is standard for a human being, but not what every member of our species is equipped with. And I hasten to add that the point of this simile is not that one is less human if one happens to not have 4 limbs. I think the point of it is that this is the standard equipment we would expect, but it doesn't have to be the equipment we would expect every member of our species to have. In the case of benevolence, then, or the other sprouts, the suggestion is not all members of our species might have these, although they would be what we regard as, in some sense, standard. The concern that some humans might not have the sprout of benevolence is also addressed explicitly by Moses in another passage with his metaphor of Ox Mountain. He says, the trees of Ox Mountain were once beautiful, but because it bordered on a large state, hatchets and axes besieged it. Could it remain verdant? Due to the rest it got during the day or night and the moisture of rain and dew, it was not that there were no sprouts or shoots growing there. But oxen and sheep then came and grazed on them. Hence, it was as if it were barren. People, seeing it barren, believed that there had never been any timber there. Could this be the nature of the mountain? So Moses invites us to imagine a mountain that was once home to a beautiful forest. However, the trees were cut down by loggers. Although the trees began to sprout again, herders brought their flocks to the mountains, and they grazed on the grass and sprouts. Now, Moses lived in an agricultural society, so he knew some things that we, at least those of us who were not raised in rural areas, often forget. That if you overlog a mountain and you cut away or eat away the remaining foliage, what's going to happen is that the topsoil will run off, leaving the mountain apparently barren. So the mountain is not barren by nature, but has become that way due to its bad environment. In the continuation of the passage, Moses explicitly links the story of Ox Mountain to human motivations. He goes on, when we consider what is present in people, could they truly lack the feelings of benevolence and righteousness? That by which they discard their good heart is just like the hatchets and axes in relation to the trees. With them besieging it day by day, can it remain beautiful? With the rest it gets during the day or night, and the restorative effects of the morning air, their likes and dislikes are sometimes close to those of others. But then what they do during the day again fetters and destroys it. Others see that such a person is an animal, and think that there was never any capacity there. Is this what a human truly is? Hence, if it merely gets nourishment, there's nothing that will not grow. If it really loses its nourishment, there's nothing that will not vanish. Moses' point is thus that a human who does not manifest the sprout of benevolence is like Ox Mountain. Just as Ox Mountain once was lush with vegetation, so is a human being naturally endowed with the sprouts of virtue. However, just as Ox Mountain was rendered barren by deforestation and overgrazing, so can a human being's sprouts of virtue be destroyed by repeatedly succumbing to a bad environment. As a result, people assume that Ox Mountain always was barren, and people assume that the vicious person always lacked the innate sprouts of virtue. But in both cases, it's due to bad environment. Now, if you had any doubts about the fact that the Ox Mountain story was intended as a development or defense of the sprout metaphors from the other passage, we just need to remind ourselves that Munzer talks about the sprouts of the virtues in the first Child of the Well story, and in the second one, he says that Ox Mountain has sprouts or shoots that were destroyed, and in the Child of the Well story, he compares somebody who doesn't have the sprouts. He says that of somebody who lacks the sprouts that they are not a human, and in the Ox Mountain story, he says that if you saw somebody without the sprouts, you would think that they were merely an animal. And the Ox Mountain story raises many philosophically interesting issues, also issues related to empirical psychology. Is it true that psychopaths are made, not born? Is it true that people become psychopaths as a result of a negative environment? As interesting as that is, though, we have to leave those questions for now. Our focus is on what the Ox Mountain story illustrates about metaphors. What I want to point out is that the notion that the sprouts of virtue can be destroyed by a bad environment is not contained within the original sprout metaphor in the Child of the Well passage. However, once we're invited to envision our incipient tendencies towards virtue as being like sprouts, the Ox Mountain metaphor is a natural and plausible extension. What I hope this illustrates is Professor Camp's insight that a metaphor both has a propositional content that can be assessed as true or false, but also by inviting us to view one thing in terms of another, it opens up a potentially infinite array of re-envisionings with further propositional content. And we cannot specify in advance what these re-envisionings will involve, and nor can we enumerate them even by recursion. Now, at the beginning of my talk, I promised you 3 metaphors or similes, and we just talked about the sprout one. But I now want to turn to one of the most influential similes in Chinese philosophy, that being sincere is like loving a lovely sight. The simile comes from the Great Learning, a brief but highly influential Confucian text. It's traditionally said to consist of an opening statement by Confucius himself, and then a commentary on it by his immediate disciple, Zheng's Master Zheng. And one of the key virtues emphasized by the Great Learning is sincerity. The Great Learning gives a famous and much debated simile to explain what it is like to have sincerity. It says, what is meant by making thoughts have sincerity is to let there be no self-deception. It's like hating a hateful odor or loving a lovely sight. This is called not being conflicted. This passage deserves to be better known among Western philosophers. However, the style is so lapidary that we have to fill in some details in order to fully appreciate it. First, what is sincerity? And in what way is it like avoiding both self-deception and being conflicted? Sincerity is the standard English translation for the original Chinese term cheng, and it's a reasonable translation. In English, we say that somebody is sincere if she is honest, if she is unaffected, if she doesn't put on a front and act as if she's something she's not. And these are certainly an important part of what it is to be cheng in classical Chinese. However, in English, we might describe a person as cheng, sincere, as sincere in English, even if they were not cheng, sincere in the Chinese sense. So, for example, when Donald Trump said of Mexican immigrants to the U.S., they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, he was being perfectly sincere in the English sense of that term. I think he was saying what he actually believes. However, Trump was not being sincere, cheng, in the Confucian sense of that term. For Confucians, a sincere person is one whose words and actions honestly express her true nature, those sprouts of benevolence, righteousness, wisdom, and propriety that monks are referred to.
It's 6 o'clock.
Thank you.
It's my computer. It's my computer.
Such a person has compassion. A sincere person, a person who is, whose words and actions honestly express her true nature of benevolence, righteousness, wisdom, and propriety, has compassion for the suffering of others, would be ashamed to make a blanket statement about any ethnic group, would disdain to do so, and would have the wisdom to disapprove of speaking without checking the facts first. Now we can see why Confucians see a lack of sincerity as a form of self-deception. To lack benevolence, righteousness, wisdom, and propriety is to fail to acknowledge the true nature of yourself as a human being. Failing in this way is only possible if we willfully ignore the manifestations of the spouse virtue. In other words, to fail to be sincere is to lie to yourself about who you really are. And when you lie to yourself in this way, you're conflicted, as the passage from the Great Learning says, because there's a tension between one part of yourself, your moral part, and another part, your selfish desires. But what is the it that should be like hating a hateful odor or loving a lovely sight? Commentators, for the most part, agree about this, and Zhu Xi, who's the single most influential commentator in the Chinese tradition, lived in the 12th century, has a very nice explanation of it. Zhu Xi's commentaries, we'll talk about Zhu Xi a little bit more in a moment, became the basis of the civil service examinations of China, and they continue to exert a huge influence on how people understand Confucianism even today. And according to Zhu Xi, this verse means that those who desire to cultivate themselves must make their hatred of evil be like their hating a hateful odor, and their love of the good be like loving a lovely sight. So it's evil you're supposed to hate like you hate a hateful odor, and it's good you're supposed to love like loving a lovely sight. But how on earth is hating a bad smell like hating evil? Wang Ming, a Confucian who lived a few centuries after Zhu Xi, offers this explanation. He says, smelling a hateful odor is a case of knowing, while hating a hateful odor is a case of acting. As soon as one smells that hateful odor, one naturally hates it. It's not as if you first smell it, and only then intentionally you decide to hate it. So one example I like to use with my students to illustrate this is, many of you are students, you live in dorms, you probably had this experience, you get up in the morning, you think, well, I'd like some milk for my cereal, or I'd like some half and half for my coffee. You go into the fridge, you take out the milk into half and half, and it's a dorm, so you figure I better smell it before I put it in my cereal or my coffee. And you smell it and you realize it's gone bad. Now, when you smell milk, or half and half, and you realize it's gone bad, you don't smell it and go, yeah, that's gone bad. That is really chunky. That is some really chunky milk. Huh. I wonder if I should put this on my cereal. Maybe I'll put it in my coffee. No, as soon as you smell it, look at it. Oh, God, that's horrible. Oh, that's disgusting. Oh, throw that out. That's horrible. Oh, no. You don't have to decide that you don't like the smell of milk that's gone bad. You don't need to decide that you're not going to put that milk in your coffee. So my hatred of evil should be the same way. When I recognize something as evil, I should be repelled by it, disgusted by it, as spontaneously and in a most thoroughgoing manner as I would be disgusted by milk that had gone bad. And I shouldn't have to think about not doing what is evil, because I should be thoroughly and spontaneously disgusted by it. Now, loving a lovely sight illustrates the same point about loving what is good, but it requires explanation to see why. This part of the simile puzzled me for many years until I eventually figured it out. So let's look quickly at the original Chinese. It's wonderfully compact. Literally, it's like, hate, bad, evil, hateful, odor, like or love, good, sa. And the tricky word is the sa at the end. The word can mean color, as in the modern Chinese expression yan sa. Thus, the distinguished translator Wing Tse Chan renders the relevant phrase, the second part here, as love a beautiful color. However, this renders the metaphor for loving what is good and the metaphor for hating what is evil quite asymmetrical. Hating a bad odor is a strong visceral reaction. Loving a beautiful color suggests a reaction is pleasant, but timid. My, what a lovely shade of blue you've painted the bathroom. Versus, oh, this is disgusting, get rid of it. Those aren't parallel to one another. James Legge, the Victorian missionary, whose translations were the standard for many years, gives us love what is beautiful. This translation presents a more comprehensible image, since our reaction to something beautiful is typically stronger than our fondness for a nice color. But "sa" doesn't mean beautiful. I think Legge knows that. I mean, Legge's actually a very good translator. I sort of disagree with him, but he's never simply wrong. There's a reason why he says what he says. I think here he's being cute, being clever, but we'll see in a minute what he's doing. But the thing is, in English, if you read this and say, oh, it's like loving what is beautiful, maybe it's like a Platonic notion of loving the beautiful. No, that's not the right way to think about it, I'm going to argue. The excellent recent translation by Ian Johnston and Wang Ping has loving a beautiful sight. And Justin Chewald and I do something similar in Readings in Later Chinese Philosophy with loving a lovely sight. But what exactly do we mean by sight here? The problem is to see how appreciating the beauty of a rainbow or the Mona Lisa. Do people still watch the Teletubbies? Raise your hand and watch the Teletubbies? Wow, okay. That's funny, because interestingly, I gave this talk at Smith a few days ago, and I asked a room full of undergraduates, and they were like, oh yeah, Teletubbies, we get that. So, I don't know if that's, if you like Teletubbies, go to Smith. If you don't like Teletubbies, you I don't know. Maybe we learn something interesting sociological fact. But the problem is to see how appreciating the beauty or the attractiveness of the rainbow or the Mona Lisa is parallel to the visceral combination of perception and motivation that's found when we're repulsed by the smell of hot milk. The key to understanding what's going on here is to dig deeper into this word "sa." In classical Chinese, the language in which the great learning is written, "sa" can mean color, it can mean appearance or expression. However, it more commonly means lust, or the physical beauty that inspires lust. Thus, Confucius once complained, I have yet to meet someone who loves virtue as much as he loves physical beauty. And that word for physical beauty here is "sa." Zhu Xi, I mentioned him a moment ago, the really influential Chinese commentator. Zhu Xi's commentary explicitly links this passage to the Great Learning. So in Zhu Xi's commentary on this passage from the sayings of Confucius, he says, loving a lovely sight and hating a hateful odor are sincerity. To reference to the Great Learning. And he says, loving virtue like one loves sex, this is to sincerely love virtue. Ties it to the Analects passage. However, people are seldom able to do this. Consequently, the basic idea here is loving a lovely sight does not refer to our fondness for a particular shade of blue, or even our admiration for the Mona Lisa. It refers to being erotically attracted to physical beauty. And by the way, this exquisite allegorical painting is Venus, Cupid falling in time by the 16th century Florentine Mannerist painter Bronzino. You come for the philosophy, but you also get an art lesson. Now, one might argue that conceptualizing attraction to goodness as being like sexual desire is intrinsically sexist. The authors of the Great Learning and over 2 millennia of Confucian commentators typically envisioned the lovely sight in question as a beautiful woman, a woman who was excluded from higher education and public office, and whose sexuality was a potentially dangerous distraction from virtue. This metaphor thus assumes what critic Laura Mulvey referred to as the male gaze. However, the situation is more complex than it appears at first. Generations of Confucians were quite aware that many an emperor was led to disaster by the influence of a handsome male lover. Furthermore, both male and female readers today can sympathize with the example of being drawn to someone erotically, even though they will conceptualize it according to their own tastes. just as contemporary feminists like myself can appreciate Aristotle's deep insights into metaphysics and ethics while being utterly repulsed by his misogyny, so can we appreciate the insights of Confucianism while acknowledging and condemning the sexist and patriarchal form that is traditionally taken. Keeping in mind these reservations and qualifications, let's return to the key similes and see what insights they offer. So the great learning tells us that we should hate evil like hating a hateful odor, and we should love goodness like loving a lovely sight. This means that we are to hate evil the same way we are repulsed by a disgusting odor, and we are to love goodness the same way we are erotically drawn to physical beauty. The substantive content of the similes is to claim that our hatred of evil and our love of goodness should be simultaneously cognitive and affective. In other words, ethical perception and motivation are, or at least should be, inseparable. For example, when we recognize that an odor is disgusting, we do not have to decide to be repulsed by it or force ourselves to treat it as disgusting. To recognize an odor as disgusting, a form of perception, is to be repulsed by a kind of motivation. Similarly, when we recognize something as evil, perception, we should be repulsed by it, motivation, just as automatically and viscerally. In short, when we hate a bad odor or hate evil, our perception of it as foul or evil is inseparable from our revulsion, which motivates us to avoid it. The visual simile makes the same point about cognition and affect. To find someone sexually attractive is to feel drawn to that person erotically. In a parallel manner, when we recognize something as good, perception, we should be drawn toward it, motivation, without the need for any strength of will. In other words, when we love a lovely sight or love the good, our perception of it as appealing or good is inseparable from our attraction, which motivates us to pursue it. Now, Confucians in general would agree with the account I've given of loving a lovely sight and hating a hateful odor, both as an interpretation of the great learning and as an account of human moral psychology. However, there's a crucial disagreement on one detail. Do the similes of the great learning describe the connection that moral knowledge and moral motivation do always have, or do they prescribe the connection that moral knowledge and moral motivation should have in a fully virtuous person? This ambiguity is suggested by a distinction drawn by Chang Yi, a Confucian philosopher of the 11th century who influenced both Zhu Xi and Wang Yangmei. He says, genuine knowledge is different from common knowledge. I once met a farmer who had been mauled by a tiger. I'm overly proud of myself about that. I discovered this weekend you could integrate sound files into PowerPoints, and so that's an actual tiger. Someone reported that a tiger had just been mauled by someone in the area, and everyone present expressed alarm. But the countenance and behavior of the farmer was different from everyone else. Even small children know that tigers can maul people, and yet this is not genuine knowledge. It is only genuine knowledge if it is like that of the farmer. And so there are people who know it is wrong to do something, and yet they still do it. This is not genuine knowledge. If it were genuine knowledge, they definitely would not do it. Here's a lovely 20th century painting, Hu Zhao Bin, Victory or Defeat, which is a tiger trying to eat a peacock. I believe it is an allegorical painting about the War of Anti-Japanese Resistance, the Second World War, as we call it in Asia and the United States. The fear of the farmer who'd been mauled by a tiger is another example of the sort of visceral combination of cognition and motivation that the great learning illustrates with the examples of a hateful odor and lovely sight. But when Chang Yi describes the knowledge of the farmer who has been mauled as genuine knowledge, this suggests that those who have not been mauled by the tiger do not really know how dangerous tigers are. That would suggest that those who know that something is wrong, but do it anyway, don't really Instead, he contrasts genuine knowledge with common knowledge. This suggests that others do know that tigers are dangerous, just not as profoundly as the farmer who was mauled. And that would suggest that those who know what is good, but do what is bad, do kind of know what is good, just not as profoundly as those who actually do what is good. So, which things should we say about the relationship between knowledge and action? The phenomenon in which a person apparently knows what she ought to do, but gives into temptation and does something else, is one of the most common and familiar aspects of our moral experience. Western philosophers refer to this phenomenon as weakness of will. And this phenomenon raises several problems, some theoretical and some practical. On the theoretical side, how is moral knowledge related to moral action in a way that even makes it possible for weakness of will to occur? The practical problem is to provide guidance to those of us who succumb to weakness of will about how to overcome it. These problems have proven so challenging that many philosophers have denied that weakness of will is possible. And a lot of philosophers in the Western tradition, from Plato and Aristotle up through Donald Davidson to the present day, have provided complicated accounts of how weakness of will is or is not possible. But what most Anglo-American philosophers are unaware of is that there's an equally impressive discussion of this issue among Confucian philosophers in China. In particular, Zhu Xi argues that weakness of will is possible, while Wang Yanming argues that it's not possible to know what is right, yet not do what is right. Zhu Xi argues that we can envision how weakness of will is possible by distinguishing between deeper and shallower forms of knowledge. When people know something but their actions don't accord with it, their knowledge is still shallow. But once they have personally experienced it, their knowledge is more enlightened and does not have the same significance it had before. I mean, a deeper and shallower metaphor, but can we say something to make that more concrete? Zhu Xi explains the difference between shallow and deep knowledge in terms of whether one is consistently attentive to that knowledge. One may already be enlightened, but not be attentive to it. Then one does not fully possess one's own enlightenment when one lacks the foundation for advancing in virtue. Consider an analogy. Suppose I have a root canal tomorrow, and I'm really worried about the pain, and it's really making my day miserable. So I decide to think instead about a nice movie I go to see, or a video game I play, or an engaging conversation I have with a friend. We would say, well, does Bryan know he has a root canal tomorrow? Well, no, of course he knows it, but he's not being attentive to that knowledge, and so it's not bothering him anymore. Why couldn't we say the same thing about moral knowledge? Maybe I know that I should not procrastinate, and that I should grade my students' essays, but instead I start to think about that really good movie I should see. Gee, I haven't seen the Battleship Potemkin yet. That great classic black and white film. I really should, YouTube that one. Or, I bet there's a really good zombie game I haven't played yet on Xbox. So, maybe I'll just go and get an Xbox game on zombies because, they'll probably run out of them. I better get it before they run out. Can't we also say in this situation that Norden knows that he should not procrastinate. He knows that he should be grading essays, but he's not attending to that knowledge, so it's not motivationally efficacious. I think this is an important aspect of Zhu Xi's model of weakness of will. In line with his interpretation of weakness of will, Zhu Xi reads the great learning as offering a two-step process of ethical cultivation. Those who desire to cultivate themselves, when they know to do good in order to avoid the bad, must then genuinely make an effort and forbid self-deception, making their hatred of the ethically hateful be like their hating a hateful odor, and their loving what is good like loving a lovely sight. In other words, first, we must obtain knowledge of what is good and bad, and then we must make that knowledge motivationally efficacious through continual attentiveness to it. The beginner in ethical cultivation cultivation will find this attentiveness difficult, and will find that she often lapses at it. However, with time, the lapses become briefer and less frequent. Juxi's account solves both the theoretical and the practical challenges the weakness of will poses. Weakness of will is possible through a failure to be attentive to the moral knowledge that we have. Our practical task as ethical agents is to avoid self-deception and be attentive to our moral knowledge until doing so becomes second nature. Consequently, Juxi sees the similes of the great learning as describing the goal of ethical cultivation that we reach eventually after years of practice. Juxi's most incisive critic was Wang Yangming. He was an interesting guy. He was a successful military general, a political official, a statesman, a guru, an impressive person in many ways. He's most famous philosophically for his doctrine of the unity of knowing and acting, which is often taken to be a denial that weakness of will is possible. Wang states boldly, there never have been people who know but do not act. Those who know but do not act simply do not yet know. Thus, the great learning gives us examples of true knowing and acting, saying it is like loving a lovely sight or hating a hateful odor. Seeing a lovely sight is a case of knowing, while loving a lovely sight is a case of acting. As soon as one sees that lovely sight, one naturally loves it. It's not as if you first see it and only then intentionally you decide to love it. Now, one of Wang's disciples questions how this is possible. The disciple says, well, for example, there are people who, despite fully knowing that they should be filial to their parents and respectful to their elder brothers, find that they cannot be filial or respectful. From this is clear that knowing and acting are two separate things. Wang responds with three arguments. And just real quickly, I'll say this ties into the talk I gave earlier today. There's a lot of philosophers in the United States who think there is no such thing as Chinese philosophy. And what I always say is, if you think there is no such thing as Chinese philosophy, that's because you've never tried to learn anything about Chinese philosophy. Because the problem of weakness of will is a philosophical problem. Wang discusses it, and he is challenged on whether it's true, and he presents arguments in favor of it. If Wang's name was John Smith, and he said these things in a Western philosophy journal, or he was Greek, there would not be any debate on this topic. So first, Wang argues that ethical knowledge is intrinsically connected to ethical motivation in the same way that knowledge and motivation are connected in loving a lovely sight or hating a hateful odor. He says smelling a hateful odor is a case of knowing, while hating a hateful odor is a case of acting. As soon as one smells that hateful odor, one naturally hates it. It's not as if you first smell it and only then intentionally you decide to hate it. Consider the case of a person with a stuffed up nose. Even if he sees a malodorous object right in front of him, the smell does not reach him, and so he does not hate it. This is simply not to know a hateful odor. The same is true when one says that someone knows filial piety or brotherly respect. That person must already have acted with filial piety or brotherly respect before one can say he knows them. So if you say you know what filial respect is, or you say you know what his good is, that's like someone who's got a stuffed up nose, and so they're willing to drink the milk that's gone bad because they just can't perceive it's bad. So for Wang, notice the similes from the great learning do not describe the goal of ethical cultivation. They describe what genuine ethical knowledge is like from the very start. In the vocabulary of Western ethics, Wang is a motivational internalist who holds that to know the good is intrinsically to be motivated to pursue it. Now, I think recognizing somebody as a philosopher is consistent with, indeed even invites us to say whether we agree or disagree. Personally, I'm more on Team Juxi than I'm on Team Wang Yangming, because I think even if we agree with Wang that moral knowledge and motivation must be connected to some extent, this falls short of the conclusion Wang needs to establish for the unity of knowing and acting. One might object that what Wang's example about the stuff-up nose shows is that there must be some level of intrinsic connection between perception and Wang offers a second argument for the unity of knowing and acting. And his second argument is that merely verbal assent is insufficient to demonstrate knowledge. He says, one cannot say that he knows filial piety or brotherly respect simply because he knows how to say something filial or brotherly. Knowing pain offers another good example. One must have experienced pain oneself in order to know pain. Similarly, one must have experienced cold or hunger oneself in order to know cold. And one must have experienced cold oneself in order to know cold, and one must have experienced hunger oneself in order to know hunger. To understand the important epistemological and linguistic point Wang is making here, consider a variation on a classic example from contemporary analytic philosopher Frank Jackson. Imagine a hypothetical individual, Mary, who is locked in a room and forced to perceive the world through a black and white television monitor. She becomes a brilliant neuroscientist specializing in vision and eventually knows everything there is to know about the physics and neurology of color experience. However, suppose she's finally released from her bondage to the black and white television monitor and can go see the world as it is. Now she will learn something new. She will finally know what phenomenal colors are like. Previously, Mary knew more about color experiences than anybody else. She could say more true things about color experiences than anybody else, but she did not know what phenomenal colors are like. Similarly, Wang says you might know a lot about pain, hunger, cold, feeling good, and goodness, but you do not know pain, hunger, feeling cold, or goodness unless you have the right experience. I remain unconvinced by this argument personally. Why? Well, in order to understand what you mean when you say, I am hungry, I would grant that I must have been hungry to really understand what you mean when you say, I am hungry. But that doesn't mean I have to be hungry now in order to understand the truth of the claim when you utter it, I am hungry. Likewise, I would say I can understand what it means to say that procrastination is wrong in the current situation, as long as I had the experience of recognizing something is wrong at some point, even if I'm not having it right here. Wang's disciple next objects that we talk about knowing and acting separately, and that this verbal distinction is valuable because it reflects the fact that there are two distinct aspects to moral cultivation. Wang acknowledges that it can be useful for practical purposes to verbally distinguish between knowing and acting. Wang says there is a type of person in the world who foolishly acts upon impulse without engaging in the slightest thought or reflection. Because they always act blindly and recklessly, it is necessary to talk to them about knowing. He goes on, there's also a type of person who's vague and irresolute. They engage in speculation while suspended in a vacuum and are unwilling to apply themselves to any concrete actions. Because they only grope at shadows and grab at echoes, it's necessary to talk to them about acting. However, Wang argues that verbally distinguishing knowing and acting is consistent with recognizing that they are two aspects of one unified activity. He goes on, I have said that knowing is the intent of acting, and that acting is the work of knowing. And that knowing is the beginning of acting, and acting is the completion of knowing. Once one understands this, then if one talks about knowing, the idea of acting is already present, and if one talks about acting, the idea of knowing is already present. To borrow an example from Aristotle, we might say that knowing and acting are verbally distinct, but not distinct by nature, like the concave and the convex sides of a curved line. Now, reviewing Wang's arguments, we can see why my teacher, the late, great David S. Niddison, remarked, there are pages in Wang sometimes that could almost make acceptable brief notes in contemporary philosophy journals like Analysis. Despite the quality of Wang's arguments, I'm personally more sympathetic to Zhu Xi's view. In addition to the objections I raised earlier against Wang's arguments for the unity of knowing and acting, I think Zhu Xi does a better job of accounting for our common sense intuition that we do sometimes do what we know, in some sense, is wrong. However, it's important to recognize that Wang's point is not purely theoretical. What he is concerned about is avoiding a particularly dangerous phenomenon. People today separate knowing and acting into two distinct tasks to perform, and think that one must first know and only then can one act. They say, now I will perform the task of knowing by studying and learning. Once I have attained real knowledge, I then will pursue the task of acting. And so, till the end of their days, they never act. Until the end of their days, they never know. This is not a minor malady, nor did it arise just yesterday. My current teaching regarding the unity of knowing and acting is a medicine directed precisely at this disease. Now, Wang has in mind the followers of Zhu Xi, whom he accuses, based on Zhu Xi's theory of the relationship between knowledge and action, as the ones who are guilty of spending their whole lives trying to know what is good and never getting around to actually being a good person. But this point is not just of historical interest, it's of contemporary relevance. Eric Spitzgable of the philosophy department at UC Riverside has done empirical research on the relationship between studying or teaching ethics and actual ethical behavior. He acknowledges that data is limited, but so far he has been unable to find any positive correlation between the theoretical study of ethics and being ethical. Now, one would argue that this proves his point. The abstract and theoretical study of ethics will not make you a better person. However, Wang would insist that what's wrong with Western ethics is not that it tries to make humans better people, but that it does not try in the right ways. If we have any interest in our courses in ethics and political philosophy making a difference, it's worth looking at what else thinkers like Cheng Yi, Zhu Xi, Wang Yangming, and other Chinese philosophers have to say on this topic. So let's review where we did. We began with the metaphor from the ancient Confucian monks that the feeling of compassion is the sprout of benevolence. I argue that this can be unpacked into the propositional claims that humans have an innate capacity for benevolence that is incipient rather than fully developed, active rather than purely passive, and capable of being cultivated rather than static. However, the propositional paraphrase does not exhaust the content of Meng's metaphor. Viewing our capacity for benevolence as sprout-like invites us to a potentially infinite range of further applications of the metaphor, including the suggestion that our innate capacity for virtue can be stunted or even destroyed, like the trees and other vegetation on Ox Mountain. Turning to the great learning, a work jointly attributed to Confucius and one of his immediate disciples, we saw that it characterizes sincerity as a state achieved when one is true to one's genuine nature as a human being. The text explains that when one achieves sincerity, one will hate evil like hating a hateful odor, and love the good like loving a lovely sight. This means that we should be repulsed by evil as spontaneously and unreservedly as we are disgusted by spoiled milk. And in addition, our love of goodness should be as spontaneously motivating as our attraction to someone whom we find erotically appealing. The fundamental point of these similes is about the unity of moral perception and motivation. But is the point that moral perception is in fact always unified with moral motivation? Or is it that moral perception should be unified with moral motivation? The ambiguity in the great learning similes is something that later Confucians wrestled with as they tried to understand the apparent phenomenon of weakness of will. The seminal 11th century Confucian philosopher Cheng Yi explained, there are people who know it is wrong to do something and yet they still do it. This is not genuine knowledge. If it were genuine knowledge, they definitely would not do it. And he illustrates this distinction between genuine knowledge and common knowledge by contrasting a farmer who genuinely knows that tigers are dangerous because he was mauled by one, as opposed to children who merely possess common knowledge because they've heard or read that tigers are dangerous. But this is still somewhat ambiguous. Is common knowledge really knowledge at all? Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming take opposing sides on this issue. For Zhu Xi, knowledge of good and evil does not necessarily motivate correct action. Loving the good like loving a lovely sight, and hating evil like hating a hateful odor are accomplishments, the results of a determined process of cultivation. love it, like loving a lovely sight. To know the bad is already to hate it, like hating a hateful odor. And I've tried to illustrate in my talk that metaphors and similes are central to Chinese philosophy. But is this something that distinguishes Chinese thinkers from Western ones? I think not. Nietzsche stated that truth is a mobile army of metaphors, which after long use seem firm, canonical, and obligatory to a people. I would agree that metaphors play a much more significant role than many Western philosophers like to admit. Consider the endless debates in normative theory among utilitarians, rule deontologists, and virtue ethicists. I suspect that what determines a philosopher's allegiance in these debates is less the arguments on any side, and more the appeal of some fundamental metaphor, which shapes everything else. For some moral philosophers, morality is mathematics. Once you are in the grip of this metaphor, utilitarianism seems self-evident, and all other positions seem perverse and irrational. For other philosophers, morality is law. Laws were originally the sort of thing carved into stone tablets by kings like Hammurabi or God on Mount Sinai. But once you've been seized by the metaphor of morality as law, anything other than rule deontology will fail to inspire the requisite awe. For other people, morality is like cooking. There are cookbooks for simple dishes, but beyond that, the standard is taste and creativity that goes beyond any simple recipes. Many virtue ethicists are in this last group. Confucianism, I think, is a form of virtue ethics, so it is not surprising that Confucius himself used a culinary metaphor to describe wisdom. Confucius said, "There are no people who do not eat and drink, but few are those who are able to appreciate the flavors." For philosophers like Confucius, utilitarianism and rule deontology both seem pseudo-rational and simplistic. However, perhaps in arguing for the priority of metaphor to argumentation, I am simply throwing eggs against the rock. Even if you do not love my presentation like loving a lovely sight, I hope that you do not hate it as much as you would a bad odor. Perhaps my talk has at least nurtured the sprout of an idea within you, and although I have only the common knowledge of a child when it comes to ethics, perhaps I have encouraged you to grasp the unity of knowing and acting for yourself. Thank you.
I'll take questions. I'll try to remember whose hands up first. Don't be shy. Is your hand going up? No, okay.
But I did really very much enjoy your presentation with all of its flourish
Oh, thank you.
and bells and whistles.
Thank you. Don't be shy. I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry. It's hard to see because there's a light in my face. Where's the hand? Oh, yes, please, ma'am. Go ahead.
Thank you. It's wonderful talk. It's very inspiring as well. So I'm
Thank
not
you.
sure whether it's a good question because somehow by the end of the talk, you somehow give your answer by pointing the ambiguity between moral action and moral motivation. But still, I'm curious, how would you respond to the other quotation that you cited, Wei Zhenhao, the Confucian? I've never seen someone who loved virtue as much as someone who loved the lovely side.
Yeah.
So it seems there's the separation between loving virtue and loving order. So supposing, so by the end you raise the question, well, it's undetermined for the Confucian scholars whether it's a prescription of people have innate understanding of virtue, or it's just a prescription that someone, I don't know, by cultivating, but still there's the undetermined thing about the innate human nature. So I was not sure whether you could elaborate that a little bit because earlier you have mentioned that it seems that there is a presupposition that virtue is something that people could naturally love or appreciate. But I'm not sure that in a contemporary kind of multiculturalist global context that that kind of particular presupposition will be naturally appealing to a lot of people. Right. Especially when we come to the strong order thing, the repulsion. If something, it becomes a second instinct.
Yeah.
And how does we do more moral or ethical reflections in a much more
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, here's,
Can
first,
you, I'm sorry,
oh,
can you rephrase that question?
oh, yeah, so I take the question to be, Mengzi gives us this, Confucians like these metaphors of loving the good like loving a lovely sight, as if this is some kind of innate universal human reaction, or hating evil like hating a hateful odor, as if that's some kind of innate universal human reaction. But given the fact that we know about great cultural diversity in the world today, is it in fact plausible to say that there is such a thing as human nature, which has common reactions to morality, both good and bad? Is that a fair?
Yeah. Well, and also how do we deal with the transformation from appreciating just pure beauty to the appreciation of virtue, which is a pretty strong
Right.
kind of proposition.
Yeah, good. So to address the first kind of concern, I think that it's clear Mengzi, in common with thinkers in many traditional cultures, including thinkers in Western traditions, thinkers in Indian traditions, often assumes that there's one correct natural course of development for human beings. And so the sprout metaphor, I like a lot of things about the sprout metaphor, but one thing I didn't make clear is suggested by it is that the sprout of an apple tree grows up to be an apple tree. The sprout of a rose grows up to be a rose. It doesn't have a choice about how it does it. So Mengzi is not a philosophical pluralist. I am a philosophical pluralist in the ethical sense that I think there are many ways to live that are equally good. And I think you could fully flourish as a kindergarten teacher, one could fully flourish as a defense attorney, one could fully flourish as a physicist. And this is not something that I think Mengzi himself recognized, but also I think not something that Plato or Aristotle recognized either. What I think, though, we can do with Mengzi, and this is something I've suggested in some of my work, the basic idea he has that it's a normal human reaction to have compassion for the suffering of others. There is actually considerable empirical evidence that this is true of human beings, that we have an instinct for compassion. There's also considerable evidence that that instinct for compassion is just incipient. It has to be developed. We're not born being benevolent. We're born with a disposition toward compassion, but that has to be cultivated to reach its full form. So Mengzi's 2,400 years ahead of Western developmental psychology on this point. And in saying this, he's saying something that has I think it's important to recognize how much cultural variation there is, but it's also important to recognize how much cultures often have in common. So we can take the story of the child at the well, and it's not as if we look at that and say, well, isn't that really quaint and bizarre that people in ancient China thought it was frightening and disturbing that a child might drown to death when it fell into a well. 2,400 years later, completely different society, we look at that and we say, I know exactly what you mean. Right? Or when you read the Bhagavad Gita, right? So when Arjuna, the Bhagavad Gita, which by the way, read it, great classic of Indian literature, it's a wonderful book, a brief, terrific book. I'm not an expert, but I like Barbara Stoller Miller's translation, but there are a lot of good translations out there. But the basic dynamic is set in play by this great warrior, Arjuna, and the situation is that he's loyalty bound to fight on a certain side in the war, but because of the loyalties he has to this side, he has to fight against relatives and friends and people he has a debt to. Now that's from India from centuries ago. Again, we don't look at that and say, wow, how quaint and weird, that these people in India thought there was something wrong with killing your friends and people, your teachers and people you owed a debt to. That's so funny. So many things we look at, or the story of Adam and Eve. You look at this and you just say, there's so many things about that. You say, well, they could have had everything. All they had to do was not eat the one tree. But human beings are like this. We're messed up creatures who do things like give us the Garden of Eden just don't do this one thing. Oh, okay, I'll just do this one thing. You can understand, whether you're Christian, Jewish, whatever, you can understand this story. You can appreciate it in lots of different cultures. So I think there's a lot of things that can still be appreciated in a multicultural world. And one suggestion I've made is that Mengzi gives us these 4 cardinal virtues: benevolence, righteousness, wisdom, and propriety. What I would say is you're living a good life in whatever society you're in, whatever culture you're in, if you can realize those virtues in your life. And you might realize benevolence, righteousness, wisdom, propriety one way if you're a kindergarten teacher. You might realize benevolence, righteousness, wisdom, and propriety a different way if you're a defense attorney. You might realize them yet a different way if you're a physicist in your life. So as long as you can realize those virtues fully in your life, I think you could say, well, that's a really worthwhile life in Mengzian terms. Although admittedly, for Mengzi, he has a much narrower conception of the ways that you should manifest those virtues. It's kind of a long-winded answer because it was such a good question.
Great question.
Yeah, it was. Well, what other questions? Yes, please.
I just wonder, the two different kinds of sprouts. One is just like a sprout from seed, and one kind of sprout from the tree trunk or branch. In my opinion, I think there are very different between the two kinds of sprouts. But what do you mean? The sprouts is the innate capacity of human being. If the sprout it just means the sprout from of a tree trunk or tree branch, I don't think it is the innate capacity of human being. It obviously that sprout is not seed. But I think most philosophers can understand the sprout as a seed.
As a thing?
As a seed.
As a seed, as growing from a seed. Okay.
So I just want to learn more from your opinion. What's the difference between these two kinds of sprouts and the sprouts from the difference between sprouts and seed? So just.
All right. So is the are you thinking of the? So let me just to clarify then. So one question is, what's the difference between a sprout and a seed?
Yeah.
And a separate one is, what's the difference between a sprout that grows out of a seed versus a sprout that comes from a tree?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I got it. So I should confess that Mengzi does, in one passage, also use a seed metaphor. So he does at one point compare the human capacity to a seed, but in that passage, he immediately goes on to say, well, people differ like plants differ because the seeds might develop in different environments. And so some seeds develop in an environment that's kind of hostile, and so they don't grow well. Other seeds develop in an environment which is very good for them, so they grow well. And likewise, Mengzi says, humans have an endowment which is pretty much the same, but they can turn out differently depending on environmental factors. So I think he's not emphasizing even there the seed-like nature. It's really what happens when that seed sprouts that he cares about. But the reason I think it's important that he likes to emphasize sprouts as opposed to seeds, which is what the metaphor he uses most of the time, is precisely that the sprout is so active. And so Mengzi's examples are things like you suddenly see a child about to fall into a well and you respond. You don't have to act, according to him, but you are going to at least have a feeling. Or King Xuan of Qi, in another famous passage in the Mengzi, this king is Mengzi talking to him, and Mengzi tells the king, you have the capacity, your highness, to become a great ruler. And the king says, how do you know that? And he says, well, I heard this story about how you saw an ox being led to slaughter, and you felt sorry for it because you said it looked like an innocent person going to the execution ground, and so you ordered for it to be spared. And so, again, in this case, the person actually does act, but it's active. It's something that you're doing. Whereas seeds kind of just sit there and wait for something to happen to them, generally water, which then stimulates them to start to sprout and look for sunlight. But once they've sprouted, they're very active. They're tracking the sun, they're sending out roots, they're trying to find something that they can grow with. So that's why I think most of the time, and he uses different terms for sprouts, but he likes the sprout metaphor more than the seed metaphor. And when the one time he uses the seed metaphor, it's clear he has in mind seeds that are just about to germinate. That's what's interesting for him. But I like your idea. It's an interesting suggestion that we might distinguish between a sprout that grows out of a seed versus a sprout that comes out of the trunk of a tree. I hadn't thought about that very much. I guess I've always envisioned it as a sprout coming out of a seed because what I'm envisioning is each of us individually as having this capacity that can be developed. If I think about it as sprouts from a tree, it's an interesting metaphor. It reminds me more of the Neo-Confucian idea, which is influenced by the Buddhist idea that we share a transpersonal nature, that you and I and everyone else share a nature, and that we could think of that as being like the tree trunk, and then your compassion and my compassion could be like sprouts from this common nature that we share. And that's interesting. I tend to think that the Neo-Confucians like Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming, although they're right about a lot of things, I tend to think they have the metaphysics wrong. So I don't think that's how the metaphysics works. But that's but just to give you an example, Zhu Xi actually reads the sprout story differently from the way I do. Zhu Xi says that it doesn't, the term duan, he thinks, doesn't mean sprout in this context. He says explicitly what it means is tip, T-I-P. And he says it's the tip, like when, and this is, Zhu Xi uses a simile. He says it's like when there's something in a box, but the tip of it is showing outside the box, so you know what's in the box. But the implication is the thing's complete, it's just hidden in the box. So Zhu Xi thinks the point is, you've got a fully developed virtue, it's just hidden by your selfish desires, like a beautiful suit might be mostly hidden in a box, but the sleeve is sticking out, so you're like, oh, there's a really nice suit in there, but I can only see part of it right now. And so that would be, maybe more like the idea of the sprout developing from the tree. And so you're in good company, but that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. It's a really interesting suggestion. Yeah.
So then to draw a new metaphor,
Mm-hmm.
or actually an analogy, would the relationship between sprouts and seeds be like the relationship between Mengzi and Shunzi in their conceptions of human nature?
Yeah, excellent question. So in the Chinese tradition, you have Kongzi, Confucius himself, and then you've got these later Confucians, the two most important ones whose works survive. We've got Mengzi, or Mencius, whom I talked about with the sprout metaphors. And then we've got Shunzi, who's the next major Confucian whose works survive. And Shunzi is a big critic of Mengzi. Shunzi, although he's a Confucian, says Mengzi's got it wrong. Mengzi says human nature is good because although we're not born fully virtuous, we're born with these tendencies towards virtue, and we will naturally grow into virtue if given the opportunity, the way the sprout of a pear tree will grow into a pear tree if given the right opportunity. Shunzi says, no, that's not right. Making a human virtuous is not a matter of developing some innate potential. And I think Shunzi's view is strong enough that he won't even be comfortable with the seed metaphor. Because the metaphor Shunzi likes is Shunzi says making somebody virtuous is like taking a piece of wood and heating it and steaming it until it bends into a wagon wheel. And he says, if you do that, it'll never bend back straight because you've done it that way. Or he says you can dye something, and when you've dyed it, the color will be changed completely. Or you can grind a piece of metal into a blade. And so those are the kind of metaphors he likes, not growth metaphors. And part of the way to think about that and why it's important is to ask yourself, how do you think people get better if they get better at all? if people get better, is it because there's something in them that's a place to start, that's kind of good, but it's got to be nurtured like a sprout? Or is the way people become good that you kind of have to reshape their motivations from the ground up? Give them motivations they didn't have before. Completely reshape them. And sometimes, in general, education feels more like what Mengzi describes, and sometimes it's more like what Xunzi describes. Right? So when you're teaching children to read, I mean, some kids really take to reading easily, some don't. My daughter took to it really easily, my son didn't. So my son, it felt more like Xunzi. It felt more like, I'm kind of making him do things and reshaping him.
He might be watching, by the way.
Yeah,
He's
well,
commented, so.
he knows I use them as examples all the time. But my kids they both turned out really great, but they turned out great in different ways. So for my son, he was really difficult growing up. He'll be the first to tell you this. Really hard growing up, but now that he's grown up, he's like a really great guy, and he's got all these like intellectual interests and artistic interests. And so, but at the beginning it was kind of like, oh, please do this. Come on, you got to do this. Whereas my daughter was kind of like, oh, yeah, no, I like reading. I like studying. And so she was more mentioning. It's just like the sprouts. So, but the end result is the same. But Xunzi thinks you usually have to think of moral transformation as authoritarian. You've got to make somebody be a good person. They're not going to do it naturally. And there's nothing there, there's not a lot there to work with internally. So even a seed metaphor is too friendly.
I have a question about Chinese claim about genuine knowledge and common knowledge.
Yes.
So he said that genuine knowledge is the knowledge you know and you will act in that way, and usually obtained by experiencing certain things, like person. But it is possible to obtain common knowledge to a level that it will influence someone as genuine knowledge. And I say, my question is, what would be the meaning of learning if only genuine knowledge will influence us in like any situation? So can someone just simply learn to be good and not experiencing extreme conditions, but because of his previous learning in that certain condition, he will still perform as a good person without experiencing? And if someone can only do that after the experience, then what would be the meaning of learning itself?
That's an excellent question, and this is one of the fundamental debates throughout the history of Chinese philosophy, is what is the point of learning in the sense of reading books and studying and learning things from other people. And to give you like really extreme examples, I mean, Zhu Xi actually and Wang Yanming, one of the things that's so interesting about their debate is they're not the most extreme people on this spectrum, but they're pretty extreme. And so Wang Yanming, his whole thing is he says, yeah, the classics are great, but of course you don't really need them because you know the answer if you're honest with yourself. And you always have access to true knowing, Wang says, or actual knowing. And you just need to use it. So, and Wang actually says, he says, I would disagree with Confucius if my own internal sense of right and wrong told me he was wrong, Wang Yanming says. He never thinks he is. But he says he's willing to do it. Zhu Xi says, for most of us, our moral sense is so screwed up that you cannot trust your own judgments of right and wrong. So, yes, sometimes you'll sense what's right and wrong, and you'll be correct, and that's where you should start. But
It's
beyond
7
that,
o'clock.
thank you. Beyond that, you need the help of classic texts and teachers. And what Zhu Xi wants to happen, and what Wang says never happens, but what Zhu Xi wants to happen is you read the text about virtue, and you immediately try to understand how that applies to your life, and you try to feel the things the text is teaching you. So, for example, one of my favorite lines in the Analects, Confucius says, to see what is right, but to not do it is to lack courage. And so, Zhu Xi might say, okay, you read that, it will give you a better understanding of what courage is, try to embody that in your actual life. And so, try to unlearn a previous conception of courage you had, which might associate courage with getting into fights or just needlessly risking your life, and instead reconceptualize it. But in reconceptualizing it, you're trying to hook up your feelings to the textual knowledge you have so that it becomes motivational. But Wang says, look, if that's what you're going to do, you're just going to spend all your time reading books and reading commentaries on them. You'll never get around to the actual feeling and doing.
Good. So our time is up. I think through this lecture, I hope you can find your sprouts of Confucianism and continue to nurture it until it will grow a very verdant, beautiful tree. So let's thank Professor.
Thank you. Thank you.